On Tralec 9, night fell like iron filings, fast, glittering, and magnetized to anything that still remembered heat. The scrapyard sprawled from crater rim to crater rim in a slow avalanche of wreckage. Ribs of cargo haulers protruding from slag, shuttle husks fused into slag sculptures by re-entry, engines gutted, and stacked like prayer wheels that no one spun anymore. In the middle of it all, bolted to the cracked spine of a derelict freighter, Rivenholt's shed clung like a barnacle to an ocean that had forgotten boats. He woke before the cold did. Old habit. The moon's thin atmosphere kept dawn a rumor until the sun finally reached over the rusted ridge and tapped metal awake with a hard knuckle. Riven lay listening to the yard's morning grammar, the micro-settling of plates, the distant clatter of scraps sliding down a heap, the antiphonal hum of two scavenger drones at the far fence debating ownership of the same panel. In that little space between sleep and work, the other sounds sometimes tried to come back. Doors slamming that had never belonged to this moon, a medbay's metronome, someone calling for help in a voice hoarse with smoke. He had learned to outweight them. Time here was a solvent that eventually thinned even the fiercest memory. Warmth came by degrees from the squat heater cobbled together from 3 generations of Starship waste heat exchangers. He levered himself upright, stiff knees negotiating terms, and shuffled to pour water from a canister into a kettle that had once been part of a fuel filter housing. The coffee he drank was a victory only because it happened. Its flavor was a rumor told by tired taste buds. He sipped anyway and stared out the slot window at his kingdom. Rows of stripped hulls, a crane that worked when spoken to kindly, a conveyor he'd taught to sing in harmony with the wind. If you looked sideways, the jagged silhouettes became a skyline. He refused himself that indulgence. Cities had never loved him back. Work made the hours tractable. On his bench waited a fusion pump the size of a child's coffin, its seals brittle, its housing cracked in 3 places where heat had argued with design and won. He cleaned the grit out of the threads with an old toothbrush until the steel remembered its own threads, then lapped the surfaces with valve-grinding compound, bringing light into metal as if polishing an eye. Bolts followed the order his hands found without his head in attendance. When a coupling stuck, he spoke to it under his breath, the way he would have to a stubborn recruit. The moon heard him and said nothing. That suited him. At midday, sky flares skittered along the horizon, the daily parade of cutters landing in the district where they took apart salvage so fine it looked almost like art. Riven stayed away from that edge of the yard. Too many hands moving there. Too many people with opinions about the value of what he kept. He preferred the bone field where no one came, the long rows of forgotten cargo pods, the cliff of kinked I-beams against which wind scraped a tired hymn. Loneliness here was simple, clean like cut metal. The loneliness inside him had edges too, but they were old and he knew the map. He ate standing, because chairs were for truths he didn't have the appetite for. A ration slab warmed over the heater, a handful of mineral nuts that crunched like old promises, a swallow of coffee now grown honest in its bitterness. The moon spun its evening into place. The shadows lengthened, then pooled. The cold unrolled from under the freighter and laid itself down at his door. He wiped his hands, closed 3 salvaged locks he had rebuilt from the bones of better locks, and checked the generator's mutter with a mechanic's affectionate suspicion. When it happened, it was a sound that failed to be metal. A fine, odd, thread-thin cry skated across the yard's usual chorus and snagged the little hook in his chest he'd sworn off using. He stood very still. It came again. Too high for machinery, too wild for wind, too alive to be permitted here. He set his mug down. He told himself it was a squealing pulley 2 piles over, a loose bracket tapping in a new breeze, a scavenger drone losing a gear. The lie stood there politely, waiting for him to climb inside it. He didn't. He picked up the plasma torch and thumbed it to a glow, the way a man lights a lantern before admitting a ghost. Outside, the night exhaled freezer air that knifed the heat under his collar. His breath smoked the way old trains do in storybooks. The torch's orange tongue painted ribs of ship hull with sickbed color. He moved through aisles of junk that knew his gait, past a field of smashed reactor housings that held the moon's pale light like bowls of old milk, past the hormone smell of leaking hydraulics. The cry came again from the notch between two collapsed cargo frames. He angled toward it, slow, the way you approach a feral thing or a hope you don't trust. They were larger than the word hatchling deserved, and smaller than anything an old terror could convincingly inhabit. 3 of them, clustered in awkward geometry of need. The foremost stood as high as his hip, scales matte ash with the powder of ground rust blurring their edges. One wing hung torn and wrong, trailing membrane like torn parchment. The second, bronze under grime, panted with shallow, irregular breaths. A length of pipe had punched through the soft flesh near its ribs and stuck there, tack-welded by its own heat. The third was the color of frost, pale as the inside of shells, eyes filmed by some mineral or illness that made them a pearly, unhelpful blur. They looked at him, not up through their eyelashes because they had none, not with any human expression he could name. They looked the way wild things look when cornered by cold and luck at once, braced to run and unable, braced to bite and unwilling, braced to be helped and unable to ask. Every species invents the gesture for please differently. He'd once been young enough to believe humans were the only ones who perfected it. He crouched because standing made him weather, and weather had never brought mercy to a battlefield. The plasma torch guttered. He turned it off and let the dark press closer, trusting the moon to draw honest edges around what was left. Old pain flared in his knee. He ignored it. "I'm unarmed," he heard himself say, and snorted at the redundancy. The ash-gray one's head tilted, one slotted pupil widening. The bronze one made a low, liquid whine and wobbled. The pale one took a half-step forward and set one foot on the toe of his boot, as if confirming that he was attached to the ground and not a trick of light. He was, very suddenly, 25 again, with a bleeding kid in his lap, improvising a compress out of a shirt that would never be clean. He blinked his way back to this cold moon. "All right," he said to no one useful. "Come on, then." The old shed seemed farther away than it was. He moved like a man carrying nitro and bad luck. The ash-gray one shadowed him at a sideways crab, wing dragging, keeping its body between Riven and the other 2, with the mathematics of guardians. The bronze one stumbled and hissed when the pipe shifted. He adjusted his hold, felt blood hot through his sleeve, and bit the inside of his cheek until the sharpness kept the present in focus. The pale one pressed so close his wrist warmed where its breath blew. Somewhere overhead, the scavenger drones changed their humming to the uncertain pitch of witnesses. He should have been talking to them all along, the way people do around panicked creatures and bombs that haven't decided whether to be bombs. Words came when the door latched behind them, and the shed remembered how to be a room. "You're all right," he lied, and heard how the pronoun answered something inside him he'd been refusing. "You're all right." Heat began to do its slow, forgiving work. Moonlight laid a strip of silver across the workbench. 3 small hearts banged against his future. Riven Holt, being inconveniently alive, reached for his tools. The shed didn't know how to be a clinic, but it learned. Riven slid the long tray of the bench out and lined it with the cleanest rags he owned, torn from the inside of a pressure suit that had never fit anyone right. He set the pale one there first, its breath fogging in the cold air until the heater caught up. The hatchling's eyes, clouded as thawing glass, blinked in his direction and then, convincingly, at his voice. "Hold still," he told the bronze one, more to himself, and bent over the pipe sunk into its side. It hadn't gone clean through. The dent at the far edge of the wound told a story of impact, of skin giving as far as skin could, and then deciding to keep being barrier. The pipe had charred into the flesh at 2 points. Heat had cauterized some of the damage. Other parts wept dark at viscous blood that smelled faintly of metal and rain. He found the saw with the finest teeth he owned and made a sleeve of leather from an old welding glove to protect skin he didn't intend to cut. "Steady," he murmured, and felt the bronze chest go still in the way creatures do when pain has negotiated a truce with fear. He cut slow, not because time would be kind, but because a blade respects what hands ask it to respect. When the pipe end fell free, it made a small, indecent clink on the tray. He slid the remaining length out with a twist and a prayer to no one, he claimed. The wound opened its mouth. He poured saline into the talk until it quieted. Sealant foam hissed, puffed, and then settled in a flexible skin. The hatchling flinched once, then laid its head on his forearm as if anchoring its pain to something rude enough to withstand it. The ash-gray one had not moved from the door, its body an obstruction in the shape of loyalty. The torn wing pulled at him even when he looked away. "You can growl later," he said over his shoulder. "I need that wing." The creature cocked its head, and after a long inhale that seemed to come from older lungs than its own, stepped forward. Up close, the damage organized into a geography he could imagine crossing, a rent along the trailing edge, two smaller punctures where metal had tried to climb through. He cleaned and dried what he could reach, then threaded filaments across the tier, laying them with the delicacy of stitches that couldn't afford to fail. The membrane warmed his fingertips, as if named heat were something it recognized now by invitation. When he was very young, and everything still belonged to before, a medic had shown him how to hold a wound closed with the pad of his thumb while applying sealant. "Press like you're telling a lie you want to be true," the medic had said. Ryven remembered the lesson and the lie and the fact that both sometimes worked if you were stubborn enough. The ash-gray hatchling's breath came in gusts that smelled of warm stone and old fire. It kept its eyes on his, not hawk still but dog steady. Trust wasn't what happened here. Something else did. An agreement, maybe, between survivors. We do this together, or not at all. The pale hatchling, the almost white one, had curled around the heater's base, making itself into a comma at the end of his haste. Its breathing had settled into a quick, reliable rhythm. In the weak light, its scales showed a line of almost invisible barbs along the edges. Some species' idea of whiskers. He dampened a cloth with warm water and mineral solution and wiped the crust from the corner of its eyes. The film softened and thinned. Beneath it, pupils unfurled like irises opening to their own color. It blinked as if turning a page and seeing, at last, the right chapter. He'd said he didn't have anything like milk in this shed, but he lied again, more productively this time, and raided the ancient food processor with a reverence usually reserved for reliquaries. Condensed protein, water stolen warm from the heater, a pinch of sodium and calcium salts he used on corroded contacts. He stirred until the mixture held together, then found the least ridiculous delivery system in reach. A siphon hose, incised to a manageable softness, the end smoothed with fine abrasive until even fragile membranes wouldn't complain. The bronze hatchling sniffed first, tongue flicking like a lizard remembering a better life. The first sip made its face crumple with betrayal. The second made it reconsider. The third turned into drinking with the concentration of a creature doing arithmetic. The pale one latched in a way that made Ryven laugh without sound, because he hadn't remembered that hunger could be beautiful. The ash-gray sniffed, hissed, and then drank like a soldier who has remembered the water is safe. They made small animal noises that did not belong to any battlefield he'd known. For a moment the shed held only those sounds and the soft, steady song of the heater. Ryven felt his hands shake for the first time. Not over a pipe that needed cutting, or a wing that needed the right lie pressed into it, but over the simple fact of the three of them in his shed behaving as if staying were an option. He worked until the edges of everything blurred, and then focused again. He replaced the heater's spent coil with a bright length scavenged from a deep core searchlight. He cut his last intact thermal blanket into 3 insulting squares, and then pretended he didn't notice when the ash-gray dragged its square next to the pale one's, making one larger, less insulting square. He reset the sensor at the door to amplify any approach into an alarm that would wake the dead. He scrubbed the blood off his hands with orange-scented degreaser that turned the basin water the color of old tea. When he finally stood still long enough for fatigue to catch him, the dragons had redistributed themselves according to a logic he did not argue with. The bronze, bandaged and fed, had stretched along the base of the bench as if holding it down was a job worth doing. The pale one had appropriated the warm trough between his boots and the heater, and fallen asleep with a 4-foot hooked over the toe of his boot, as if arresting his idea of leaving. The ash-gray sat in the threshold between the sleeping and the day, one eye on the door and one on him, an economy of vigilance that would have moved him to poetry if anyone else had been alive in this room to witness the attempt. "Crank," he said to the ash-gray. the name arriving with the satisfaction of a bolt finally threading. The head tilted. Cinder, to the bronze, whose breathing had taken on a slow piston lullaby. Whistle, to the pale, who made a small, high noise even in sleep, as if the stars it sang to had work for it still. He didn't ask permission. Names are sometimes the first bandage. The heater pinged as it settled into the long evening. Outside, the yard ground its teeth in the wind. A cut panel banged 3 times, remembered its fastener, and went quiet. Ryvan sat on the floor because chairs had too much ceremony for a moment like this. He let the back of his head rest against the workbench's leg. The cold crawled up from concrete into the seams of his coat. A warm paw landed against his ankle and sent it retreating. He tried to count the last time a living thing had trusted him enough to sleep with its hand on him, and failed. The failure was a relief. He closed one eye, and then the other, and then both. Half asleep, he listened to 3 breaths, and made a promise he did not say out loud because that would have made it louder than this room deserved. No one had brought him home from any of the wars he'd actually fought. He'd brought himself to a graveyard instead, and taught himself how to live there. Now, in a shed built out of ship bones and stubbornness, the universe had carried 3 small, impossible presents to his door and dared him to be the kind of man who opened it. He was. And the act of staying seated on a cold floor while creatures too young for their own danger slept on his boots felt like a medal that didn't itch. The generator hummed. The heater glowed. Somewhere under the workbench, a tail ticked once in what his treacherous heart insisted was contentment. Ryvan Holt, who had no one, had someone pressing a pulse into his ankle and another warm weight anchoring his boot. The shed, which had held only wind and metal for years, held a family without asking his permission. He let the fact settle like heat into old steel, and for the first time in a span of years, he'd stopped measuring, closed his eyes on purpose. Morning stitched itself into the shed by way of the heater's soft ping and the pale hatchling's featherweight snore. Ryvan woke with Whistle's foreclaw still draped across his boot, like a paperclip securing a document no one was allowed to file away. Outside, the scrapyard's tide had shifted. Scavenger drones traded gossip. A crane chain thumped twice against its mast. The wind hauled daylight over the fence like contraband. He moved slow so the night wouldn't remember him. Cinder cracked one eye and pretended not to be watching. Crank, who had fallen asleep sitting guard, toppled gently onto his own folded wing and woke with a rumble of embarrassment, which he tried to pass off as a stretch. Easy, Ryvan told them, and meant himself as much as the dragons. Work grew out of need, and need was everywhere. He rigged a dew still from a run of copper tubing and the belly of a defunct condenser, hung it from the shed's rafters, and in an hour listened to the silver tick of water finding the collection pan. He boiled mineral salts into the dew until it tasted like a story the body believed. Whistle drank with ceremonial focus, whiskers trembling with every swallow. Cinder slurped and then tried to help by rearranging the tubing with her teeth. Crank stood under the drip and let it bead on his brow as if taking rain was a duty. The torn wing demanded discipline. Ryvan laid out a brace from shock cord and a split length of composite, light, forgiving, uglier than anything he'd built with pride, but right for this moment. Crank submitted with the offended dignity of a patient who understands the necessity and reserves the right to complain later. Flex, Ryvan said, and the wing trembled, muscles learning their geometry again. Hold. The dragon held. Good. He didn't use praise much. He found to his surprise that he remembered how. Cinder turned rehabilitation into a game he hadn't known he owned. Dragging coils of wire across the yard, leading Crank in cautious arcs between piles, so the wing could remember flight as a verb long before it was a fact. When Ryvan's back went tight and old pain came for his breath with the efficiency of a debt collector, Whistle pressed her narrow jaw under his hand and hummed a note so low it seemed to come from the ground. The ache loosened its grip. He didn't say thank you. He checked the generator for the 6th time instead and pretended that was the same thing. They learned the yard's routes like a map of a body, which lanes held knives, which doorframes bit, which piles sighed when you asked too much. Crank took to shadow like a soldier, moving where there was no room to move, and coming out without a scratch he had not meant to take. Cinder adored the crane, and with a child's alarming genius, figured out which lever made the hook dance. Whistle discovered the empty bellies of cargo pods and sang to them, calling back echoes that weren't quite echoes, tones that found balance in rust and shifted it, that made seized bolts reconsider their religion. The first time a corroded engine nut spun free under his fingers while Whistle trilled nearby, Riven froze and then laughed once, short and incredulous. "You keep that up," he said, "and we'll have this place clockwork by winter." In the afternoons he taught them the rules that keep living things attached to futures. Never put your face where a hinge swings. Never trust a panel that moves without being asked. Never step on a cable whose job is to pretend to be floor. They pretended to forget and remembered when it counted. When he said stay, Crank stayed like a wall. When he said careful, Cinder slowed a fraction and glanced back with a look that said, define careful. Whistle, who seemed to have been built with a siren in place of lungs, learned quiet when he touched 2 fingers to her brow. He began to measure his days by the number of times that gesture worked. One sunset found him on the ridge of a collapsed freighter spine, legs dangling, a bowl of stew cooling on the rib beside him. The dragons sprawled in an untidy crescent at his feet, full of water and mischief, content as anything that had recently solved hunger. The sky above Tralec 9 staged its daily melodrama, bands of copper cloud, a cold star sharpening toward night. Riven tilted the bowl for the last mouthful and saw, over the western scrap dunes, a thread of smoke lift and unspool, too straight for weather, too steady for accident. He didn't move. He watched how the wind failed to take it, how the column thickened, black inside the gray, a refinery burn-off, except there were no refineries within a day's walk. A flare stack, except no one had tapped a field here since the freight lanes died. He set the bowl down without the satisfying clink. "Inside," he said, voice flat by choice. They came to their feet as if someone had tugged an invisible line. In the shed, Riven pulled the tarp off the old shortwave array, a tangle of coils and indignation he'd told himself he kept only for nostalgia. The dial found a signal that hadn't existed yesterday. Bird voices, coordinates, the clipped humor of men who let money do their fear. He dragged the volume down until the whispers sounded like insects crawling across foil. Cinder nosed the back of his hand. Whistle pressed close enough that his sleeve warmed. Crank took the door and made himself larger in the low light without moving. The comm hissed and spit a proper noun, Atrox. Riven felt his lungs forget the second half of their job. Old empire, engineered beasts, bounties that turned decent men carnivore. He shut his eyes and saw 3 animals too young for their own myth asleep on scraps of thermal blanket, then opened them because he had work the world couldn't see. He unbolted the lockbox where he kept the tools he'd sworn never to pick up again. The shock pistol came out heavier than justice. He hated it in his hand and strapped it on anyway. "We're not running," he told the dragons, "because there are lies you tell your gut so your hands can stay busy. We're making this place unfriendly." They did. He strung line mines low between piles, the kind that did nothing but make a noise that frightened knees. He rerouted the crane's rails into an ugly loop over the main approach, hung an engine block from a chain, and wired the release to an old doorbell from a ruined bar. Cinder watched, memorizing everything and pretending not to. Whistle's hum shook screws out of rotted wood and dropped them into his palm. Crank pressed his forehead to Riven's shoulder exactly once, a gesture with the weight of a promise. When the smoke turned the color of money, he doused the lights, put his back to the bench, and listened to the yard breathe. Overhead, the scavenger drones switched to a wary, off-key hymn. The comm spoke coordinates again, closer this time, the rhythm of engines beneath the words. He thought of the life he'd made out of dead things, and then of the 3 so carefully alive ones dividing his floor with their bodies so that nothing larger than wind could cross it without stepping on affection. "All right," he whispered, the word a clasp closing. "Come on." The first skiff announced itself with a cone of blue exhaust slipping over the far fence and floodlights that tried to bully darkness into confession. The second cut its engine and ghosted in on momentum, a smug hunter in a coat of quiet. By the time the third went belly up over the slag ridge to put a man on the crane mast with a long rifle and a long memory, Riven had already moved 3 steps left to the place where the mast's own shadow refused light. Voices carried, deliberate. Heat signatures, 3. Juvenile scale density, 1 adult humanoid, easy pick. Another voice, older and impatient. Careful with the white one. That's the money. Heat climbed Riven's face the way it climbs a forge when you push it to confession. He took the old doorbell's cord in one hand. He had built the trap to discourage, not to break. He had told himself 15 times that the difference mattered. The first raider crept down the lane between a stack of ribs and a tangle of girders, boots testing debris like a tongue testing a bad tooth. Riven pressed his thumb to the bell. The engine block swung out of night like the right answer to the wrong question. It shattered a floodlight and a reputation in the same breath. The raider went off his feet with a noise that had nothing to do with bravery. The skiff behind him fishtailed, pilots blinded. Cinder, who had been vibrating like a plucked wire, bolted. Riven opened his mouth to call her back and then shut it when he saw what she meant to do. She hit the crane's release with her shoulder, and the chain spilled another surprise into the lane. A string of magnetic nets that he had swiped from a junked security rover and rewired with fewer ethics. They bloomed over 2 more men as prettily as flowers and clung with more conviction than romance. Crank flowed forward, low and wide, and placed one heavy forepaw gently but decisively on a netted thigh. The man under it learned the choreography of stillness. The rifle on the mast cracked. Metal near Riven's ear screamed and found new opinions about shape. He ducked, rolled, came up behind the mounting bracket of a defunct turbine, and racked the shock pistol out of retirement. The shot took the rifleman square in the chest at stun. The man flopped once, twice, and reconsidered his career on the platform, then slid bonelessly down the ladder in a performance that would have impressed gravity if gravity were sentimental. Back. Someone shouted from the skiff now stuttering between junk islands. Call a drone. Snag and bag. We don't need the old man. Whistle answered before Riven could. The pale dragon stepped into the open, small even at her fiercest, and inhaled. The note she released wasn't music. It was a line of math laid across the yard, at a frequency metal had to obey. Bolts shivered. A stack of ducting sang and fell apart like a lazy trick. The skiff's front grating hummed, cracked, and dropped, snared in its own intake. The pilot swore in a language made of childhood and regret. Whistle kept singing, eyes wide and unfocused, like a radio listening for its own signal. Riven put a hand on her shoulder before power could eat kindness. Enough, he said, and she cut the tone off so abruptly the silence rang. The yard filled with smells, hot insulation, spilled propellant, the old mineral stink of fear. Men recovered from surprise with the enthusiasm of professionals. A drone popped up from behind a slag heap, net launcher deployed, low and fast like a bad decision with wings. Riven's pistol would only make it angrier. He didn't aim for the drone. He shot the release on the tower ladder, and when the bracket failed, the ladder swung down and scythed the drone out of the air with the antic elegance of a lucky accident. It didn't feel like luck. It felt like a place he knew answering with what it had. He grabbed the ladder's rung to stop its second swing and barked his shin so hard he saw old constellations. Cinder streaked past in a flare of bronze, clamped the drone's wing with her teeth and shook until pieces learned independence. Then she looked at him with the delighted offense of a child who has just won at a game she invented and wants a ruling. He grinned despite himself. Approved. They were winning the yard. They were not winning the sky. The quiet skiff had backed off and was calling in real teeth. Long-range tranks, a capture balloon, a cannon meant to write morals on the side of hills. Riven saw the server blink of a rangefinder on a far ridge and knew the shot would come through anything he could hold up, including himself. He didn't think. He moved, the way you move when an old training reasserts itself, not as violence but as habit. He planted between Whistle and the line and lifted both hands. The first trank hit him in the coat, sank, and met a lifetime's worth of stubborn wired into the lining. The second took him lower, where he'd idiotically never bothered to stitch armor. Cold spread through his thigh like spilled mercury. The world narrowed on schedule. He stayed up by lying to the ground about what it was allowed to be. "Down," he said hoarsely to the pale dragon, and Whistle obeyed so fast she seemed to vanish. Crank took his place like a tide rolling in, massive and unavoidable, and accepted 2 rounds to the brace shoulder with a roar that stole a piece of night. The roar wasn't fire. It was thesis. Men recalculated. Somewhere behind them the old fusion rig coughed, a death rattle he'd been ignoring for 6 months. He did the math without wanting to. If it went when the wind was wrong, the whole yard would become a teaching aid about why hydrogen doesn't like to be mocked. He staggered toward it, vision strobing. The dragons moved with him as if connected by rope. "Hold them," he told the universe, and the universe, out of either mercy or a taste for spectacle, did. He threw the brake the wrong way first and swore, then flipped it properly and jammed the manual vent lever with his palm until his knuckles split. Vapor screamed and then came to terms, settling into a steady hiss that made the hair on his arms lie down. He turned back, ready to use his body for anything it could still do. The next sound was older than any yard. It dropped over the skiffs and the men and the wreckage like a verdict from a higher court. Not a roar. Not thunder. The long, rolling throat of something that had beloved the sky before men could name it. Riven squinted up through the drifting foam of cold vapor and saw shadows that didn't belong to his dragons write themselves across the stars. They didn't descend like cavalry. They loomed, great as misremembered mountains, bioluminescence veining their flanks, eyes phosphorescent coins. For a span of heartbeats, even the raiders remembered to be small. One of the newcomers peeled off from the others and hovered over the lane where nets had flowers for men. Another stationed itself above the quiet skiff and turned its head, very slowly, until the skiff remembered it had brakes. Whistle stood in the open, trembling with a terror that wasn't fear. She sang one note, thin, pure, barely audible at human scale. The enormous head above tilted. The light along its jaw brightened, then softened, then brightened again. If communication needed grammar, it found one, old and efficient. Riven realized his hands were empty, no ring on a trigger, no tool wound in fist, and that he didn't miss either thing. He was bleeding and standing and laughing a little because he didn't know what else to do with the surge inside him that felt like being forgiven by a place you hadn't realized you'd wronged. The raiders made the calculation men make when they are outnumbered by something they have not yet learned how to insult. They retreated with a lack of ceremony that would have served them better on arrival. One skiff limped, one sulked, one pretended it had never been here at all. The yard drew its breath back into itself. The big shapes in the sky did not land. They drifted, watching, silent as religion. When it was clear the ground belonged to someone else again, they turned and went away in the direction of the smoke that had started the evening, as if they had more letters to deliver to men who had forgotten how to read. Riven sagged against the fusion rig and found Whistle's forepaw already there, steadying him with the savagely gentle insistence of a hand on a shoulder. Cinder stuck her face into his and snorted indignantly until he scratched the sneer out of her brow. Crank stood where the lane opened into night, a vast, gray door that nothing unfriendly would choose to use twice. The sedative in his leg finally remembered its job and laid a quilt over his nerves. He slid down the rig until he was sitting on the floor, with his dragon's weight braced across his shins, and the wind bringing him the expensive smell of men who had come for blood and left with humility. The night above the yard was busy again, with stars trying to be the first to tell this story to a different horizon. "All right," he said, as if calling the end of a shift. His voice shook, and then decided it didn't need to. "We're still here." Whistle answered with a little exhale that found the old scar above his heart like a homing beacon and warmed it as if scars could be persuaded. Cinder dragged the mangled drone wing over and presented it like a trophy and a question. Crank leaned his head against Riven's shoulder with the heavy care of a friend who doesn't mind that you're pretending not to cry. The scrapyard learned a new silence then, the kind that follows not loss, but survival, a quiet with room in it. Somewhere the bell he'd welded from a bent strut and a piece of an engine cowling chimed once in a stray breeze and then settled. The yard had defended its own. The old mechanic, who had thought himself a ghost among bones, found himself counted as living by 3 small beings who hadn't asked his permission before deciding he was family. Dawn arrived stained with smoke and the thin taste of singed insulation, a tired light that found Riven asleep sitting up, chin on his chest. 3 small bodies weighted across his shins like warm ballast. The sedative's cotton left his head by degrees. Pain clocked in on schedule. He let it. The yard, so loud the night before, now breathed like a creature that had survived its own alarm. He stood when the dragons did, which meant he stood slowly. Cinder pressed her brow into his palm and complained in theatrical chirps until he laughed, and the sound convinced her the world was working again. Crank flexed the braced wing and accepted another layer of filament without pretending not to flinch. Whistle climbed the heater with all the poise of a drunk saint and hummed a note that located his pain and shook it loose like a screw that didn't belong. Overhead, the great shapes had not entirely left. They hung high on the blue-white seam where atmosphere remembers vacuum, bioluminescent veining pulsing slow as thought. Guardians or judges, it hardly mattered. Their patience felt like permission. When the sun finally shouldered over the ridge, those giants turned as one, cut long shadows across the slag, and glided toward some other obligation. Whistle watched until their light went faint as rumor. Then she put her forehead on Riven's knee and stayed there, the smallest pledge in a world of extravagant ones. The aftermath had jobs for every hand and claw. They hauled nets into a heap and cut men loose one by one, binding wrists without malice and radioing the salvage guild with coordinates and a suggestion to come wearing better manners. Riven patched holes in the fence with plates stamped from a raider's skiff, a petty triumph that warmed him more than the heater. Cinder nosed the mangled drone into the shed with the proud disgust of a cat presenting a scandalous mouse. "You brought me a project," he told her. "Of course you did." He turned the drone wing into a wind chime because that's what his hands asked for. He cut the aluminum into 3 long tongues, riveted them to a hoop he bent from a cracked escape ladder, and hung the contraption from the crane hook over the main lane. The first breeze of afternoon rang it. Thin, uncertain, an instrument remembering its job. Cinder cocked her head, offended and intrigued in equal measure. Whistle breathed on the tongues, found the frequency that set them singing rounder, and smiled the way only dragons can, with eyelids. The shortwave brought company before evening. A battered ranger shuttle settled at the far pad and exhaled officials whose uniforms had survived nicer postings. The captain came in without drawing a weapon, a good sign, and glanced meaningfully at Crank, who glanced back like a boulder with opinions. "Whole sector heard something," the captain said, doffing his hat to the wind chime. Sounded like a yard refusing to be robbed. Riven gestured at the nets, the stunned raiders, the drones sifted into shame. "We had help," he said, tipping his chin as if he could indicate the sky that way. The captain's eyes followed the gesture to the emptiness where giants had been. He didn't pretend to have a policy for that. He didn't need one. Paperwork wanted names and quantities. Riven gave it what it could digest and no more. When the form asked for owner of protected assets, he folded the page in half and laid it under the chime's shadow. Crank stomped the corner with one careful paw. The captain watched without smiling, which was its own kind of grace. "What do you want this place called?" he asked, pen poised over a blank that had never been given to Riven before. Riven's mouth opened on Scrapyard and closed on home. He looked at the 3 dragons, ash-gray and stubborn, bronze with grease on her whiskers, pale as a secret told to the right person, and tried the word aloud, surprised to hear how steady it came. Dragon's Rest. The ranger wrote it where it would count. "We'll post a sanction," he said. "Not law exactly. Something like a courtesy the rough know how to fear." He leaned in, voice quiet enough that paperwork couldn't hear. "You're not alone anymore, Holt. The guild came for the netted men and collected them with the ceremonial disdain reserved for thieves who got caught by better thieves. The skiffs were towed off in pieces that would find new lives as fence plates and soup pots. By evening, the wind chime had decided on a key. The shed smelled of mineral broth and weld smoke. Riven etched 3 names into the gate's uprights with a carbide scribe. Small, sharp letters low enough for muzzles to read. Crank, Cinder, Whistle. Beneath them, because the hand didn't want to stop, and because someone had to say it out loud to make it true, he scratched his own. Halt. Night came without malice. He pulled the cot out under the crane, because inside felt too small for a day that had held so much motion, and spread the old thermal blanket until it stopped arguing. The dragons arranged themselves in an untidy clover around him, as if their algorithm for safety required a human in the center. Over their heads, the chime counted the breeze in low notes. He listened until it matched his breathing and understood with the bone-level relief of a man putting down a load no one else could see that the promise he'd made the previous night had survived the day. Inside the shed, the shortwave muttered as transmissions slid past, indifferent and endless. He turned the dial off. He had better voices here. Change happened the way all durable things do, one fix at a time. Riven ran cable along the freighter spine and mounted lamps that turned night into a choice. He rebuilt the busted fusion rig's heart with a salvaged core that clicked into place like a sentence corrected. He braided rope from wire and hung it as handholds up the steeper piles, more for visitors than for dragons. Traffic found them anyway. A prospector with a cracked reactor lens, a courier with a hull scar the length of a bedtime story, a child who had heard a rumor about white scales and came clutching a bolt she was sure would be required at the gate. Crank took the perimeter as a vocation. He walked it at false random hours. A gray metronome with a scarred wing, he worked like a new hinge until flight wasn't just an argument, but a possibility. Cinder made friends with the crane and, under supervision and a safety speech performed 20 times for a single successful memory, learned to swing a hook with grace enough to lower a thruster bell onto an engine cradle without testing anyone's religion. Whistle discovered that the empty bellies of cargo pods made better instruments in the afternoon than at dawn, and tuned the yard most days into something approaching a song. People brought offerings without being asked. Bolts, yes, but also stories. A miner set a chipped mug on the bench and said it had belonged to someone who taught him how to keep a hand steady the first day he learned a welder. A pilot slipped a bright ribbon over the gate latch and refused to admit it was for luck. Someone carved the outline of a dragon into the rust at shoulder height and then, embarrassed, rubbed it out with their sleeve. The stain stayed. Riven found a use for everything that could be taught. He showed children wear sharp hides. He taught their parents the trick of listening past the noise a broken thing makes to the smaller sound of what it wants to be. He made a harness not for riding. He could hear how his knees laughed at that, but for letting Crank lift him 3 feet off the ground and carry him in a slow, ceremonial circle so the old man could see his yard from a height he had once only remembered in bad dreams. He cried the first time Cinder set him down without stealing a single tool in the process. No one mentioned it. Whistle put her forehead to his and sang a note so quiet it never left his skull. The sign over the gate came last. He burned it into a panel hammered flat from a raider's skiff skin, letters clean as new promises, Dragon's Rest. He did it at noon because witnesses make vows sturdier. The ranger captain, sunburned again, hat off, stood by with a sanction form rolled in his fist and a smile he tried to keep out of official records. The xenobiology tech arrived dusty and euphoric, with a crate of mineral feed and the kind of patience that ruins myths and builds better ones. A clutch of neighbors clustered by the fence pretending they were only out to see if the wind chime was in tune. The chime obliged them. Paper was signed. Hands were shaken. Someone started a pot of stew big enough to embarrass hunger. In the late light, when the shadows went long and honest, the big shapes returned, silent, slow, riding their patient ribs across the sky. They didn't land. They banked once, twice, acknowledging what the ground had accomplished without them. Whistles stood on the freighter spine and sang a soft greeting you felt more than heard. The giants tipped a wing and slid away toward the horizon where their work was. That night the yard was busier than it had a right to be. Children fell asleep against piles that had terrified them at noon. The chime talked with the breeze in a language that didn't need verbs. Someone played a harmonica, as if remembering how breathing worked. Crank slept with his chin on the gatepost, a stone that dreamed. Cinder, dead to the cosmos, snored in a rhythm that made the crane sway. Whistle curled behind Riven's knees like a crescent moon gone affectionate. He took his boots off. It felt like treason until it felt like proof. Above him, the scrap-stitched clouds parted and showed a slice of hard, exact stars. He named none of them. He didn't have to. His world had shrunk enough to fit in his hands and expanded enough to make room for 3 more hearts. Sometime near midnight, a breeze came down off the ridge and found the chime. It rang once, twice, a clean tone that asked nothing and confirmed everything. Riven's eyes closed on purpose. The past, courteous for once, stayed in its lane. In the circle of dragons and the square of lamplight and the crooked oval of a moon that had finally decided to love what was left on it, the old mechanic slept,